Something changed around 2012. Not gradually, not imperceptibly, but in a way that shows up clearly in the data when you know where to look. Rates of teenage depression began rising. Rates of anxiety began rising. Rates of loneliness began rising. Rates of self-harm among adolescent girls began rising. Rates of suicide among teenagers began rising. And the timing was not random. 2012 was the year that smartphone ownership crossed 50% among American teenagers. It was the year Instagram began its ascent. It was the year the social life of an entire generation moved, largely and permanently, from the physical world into the screen. Social psychologist Twenge has spent decades studying generational differences in psychological well-being. In her analysis of data from more than 1 million American teenagers, she identified what she calls the Great Disruption, a sudden, sharp deterioration in adolescent mental health that began in almost exactly 2012 and has continued since. She calls the generation born after 1995 iGen, the first generation to grow up with smartphones as a constant presence from early adolescence. And the data she has assembled paints one of the most concerning pictures in the modern history of child and adolescent psychology. But the story is not simple. And the people who tell you it is simple, either those who say social media is unambiguously destroying young people or those who say the concerns are overblown and the research is weak, are missing something important. The truth about what social media is doing to an entire generation is layered, contested, and in some ways more disturbing than the simple version, precisely because it is so much harder to resolve. Start with what the data actually shows. Across multiple large-scale surveys conducted over the last decade, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, the Monitoring the Future Study, the American Freshman Survey, the pattern is consistent. Rates of depression, anxiety, loneliness, and poor mental health among American teenagers have risen substantially since the early 2010s. The increases are largest among girls. Adolescent girls who report heavy social media use are 2 to 3 times more likely to report depressive symptoms than girls who report low social media use. Among boys, the effects exist but are smaller. Among adults, the effects are smaller still, though not absent. These are correlations. And correlation is not causation, a point that critics of the social media hypothesis raise correctly and persistently. But the correlation is strong. It is consistent across multiple datasets and multiple countries, and it coincides with a very specific technological change in a way that is difficult to explain by other means. Researcher Jonathan Haidt, who has written extensively about this data, argues that the circumstantial case for social media as a primary driver of the adolescent mental health crisis has become strong enough to meet the bar for precautionary action even in the absence of definitive proof. His critics argue that the effect sizes are smaller than claimed, that other factors, economic stress, academic pressure, climate anxiety, are driving the trends, and that the data does not justify the alarm. Both positions contain truth. The data shows real deterioration. The causal mechanisms are genuinely contested. What is not contested is that something significant has happened to the psychological well-being of young people, that it happened at a specific time, and that that time coincides with the mass adoption of smartphones and social media platforms among adolescents. So what are the mechanisms that researchers have proposed? There are several, and they operate at different levels. The first is social comparison at unprecedented scale and intensity. Adolescence is already the developmental period in which social comparison is most psychologically powerful. Teenagers are biologically primed to care intensely about their social status, their appearance, their acceptance by peers. This is not a cultural artifact, it is evolutionary. The peer group becomes more important than the family during adolescence because in the ancestral environment, successfully integrating into a peer group was the developmental task that determined adult social competence and survival prospects. The anxiety of adolescence, the intense self-consciousness, the desperate need to belong, these are ancient. They were there long before social media. What social media did was take this already intense developmental vulnerability and expose it to a new kind of social environment. One that is available 24 hours a day, that provides continuous quantified feedback on social acceptance in the form of likes and followers and comments, that presents the most curated and attractive versions of peers rather than the full reality, and that allows social dynamics, inclusion, exclusion, bullying, romantic rejection, to follow adolescents into their bedrooms and onto their phones at every hour of every night. In the ancestral environment and in the social environment of previous generations, the school day ended. The weekend began. The peer group was temporarily absent. Adolescents had time, enforced time, away from the social pressure of their peer group. They had time to recover, to reset, to be in a context where their social standing was not being continuously measured and updated. Social media removed that refuge. For the first time in human history, adolescents can be excluded, mocked, compared, and judged at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, in a space that used to be private and safe, by the same peers they will face at school the next morning. The second mechanism is sleep disruption. This one has among the clearest evidence. Studies consistently show that heavy social media use among adolescents is associated with later bedtimes, shorter sleep duration, and poorer sleep quality. The mechanisms are multiple. The blue light from screens suppresses melatonin production. The emotional activation generated by social content makes it harder to wind down, and the fear of missing out creates a psychological pull toward the phone that keeps teenagers online past the point where they would naturally fall asleep. Adolescents need between 8 and 10 hours of sleep per night for healthy brain development. The majority of American teenagers are sleeping significantly less than this. Sleep deprivation is itself a significant cause of depression, anxiety, emotional dysregulation, and impaired cognitive function. The sleep disruption pathway alone, independent of all the direct psychological effects of social comparison and cyberbullying, may account for a meaningful portion of the deterioration in adolescent mental health. The third mechanism is displacement of beneficial activities. Time is finite. Time spent on a smartphone is time not spent on activities that research consistently links to positive adolescent mental health. Face-to-face social interaction, physical activity, sleep, reading, hobbies that involve mastery and flow, unstructured outdoor time. Studies of how American teenagers spend their time show that across the period of the mental health deterioration, time on screens increased and time on almost every other category of beneficial activity decreased. The smartphone did not just add a new activity to the lives of teenagers. It replaced other activities, and the activities it replaced were systematically more beneficial than the activity it substituted. The fourth mechanism, and perhaps the least discussed, is the effect of social media on the developing sense of self. Adolescence is the developmental period during which identity is constructed, when young people are trying to figure out who they are, what they value, what kind of person they want to become. This is a process that requires privacy, experimentation, failure, and time. Social media exposes this process to a permanent audience and creates incentives to manage the presentation of self rather than to authentically develop one. The teenage self becomes, in part, a performance, a carefully managed personal brand optimized for the response of an audience. The feedback the audience provides, likes, comments, follower counts, becomes a substitute for the more difficult and genuine process of developing an internal sense of self-worth that does not depend on external validation. Psychologist Mary Aiken, who studies the impact of technology on human behavior and development, has written that the internet and social media have created what she calls a cyber accelerator for normal adolescent developmental processes, taking experiences that were already intense and compressing them, amplifying them, and removing the natural limits that the physical world imposed. Adolescence was always a period of social intensity. Social media made it more intense, more quantified, more continuous, and harder to escape. There is something important to understand about who is most affected. The data consistently shows that the effects of social media on mental health are not uniform. Heavy passive consumption, scrolling through other people's content without creating or connecting, is associated with worse outcomes. Active use, creating content, messaging friends, using social media as a tool for genuine connection, is associated with better or neutral outcomes. The distinction matters because it suggests that the problem is not social media per se, but a specific pattern of use, one that involves intensive exposure to curated images of other people's lives without the reciprocal connection that actual relationships provide. The effects are also significantly worse for girls than for boys. Researchers have proposed several reasons. Girls are more likely to engage in appearance-based social comparison. Girls are more likely to be targets of cyberbullying. Girls are more likely to engage in the kind of heavy passive scrolling associated with worse outcomes. And the platforms most associated with image sharing and appearance comparison, Instagram in particular, are disproportionately used by girls during the period when body image concerns are most developmentally acute. The platforms themselves have known about these effects. The internal Facebook research revealed through whistleblower Frances Haugen showed that the company's own research found Instagram was toxic for the body image of teenage girls. The research showed that Instagram made body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teenage girls. It showed that teens who reported suicidal ideation traced the thought to Instagram. The company conducted this research, found these results, and continued to grow the platform among teenage users because the teenage demographic is extraordinarily valuable to the advertising model. The harm was documented. The growth continued anyway. This is the part of the story that tends to get lost in the debate about whether the research is conclusive enough to justify alarm. The question of whether social media definitively causes depression in teenagers is a scientific and methodological question, and reasonable researchers can disagree about the answer. But the question of whether the companies that build these platforms knew they were causing harm and continued anyway is not a scientific question. It is a moral and legal one. And on that question, the internal documents are clear. What does this mean for the generation growing up inside this environment? It means they are navigating adolescence, already the most psychologically demanding developmental period in human life, inside an environment that is more socially intense, more continuously evaluative, more exposing, and less forgiving than any adolescent environment in human history. They are doing this without the precedent of anyone who has done it before, without the tools that would help them do it well, and with platforms actively designed to maximize their engagement regardless of the consequences for their well-being. They are not weak. They are not fragile. They are not a generation that cannot handle difficulty. They are a generation that was handed a developmental environment that no human being evolved to handle, by companies that knew what they were doing and did it anyway, at an age when they were least equipped to protect themselves. And the adults who handed it to them, who gave children smartphones at 10 and 11 and 12, who allowed social media platforms to be used by children without the protections that physical spaces require, who framed the resulting suffering as a generation's weakness rather than a system's failure, those adults have a great deal to answer for. Understanding what social media is doing to an entire generation is not just an academic question. It is a question about what kind of environment human beings can actually thrive in, what responsibilities institutions and companies have toward the people they affect, and what it means to protect the developmental conditions that young people need to become whole. The data is real. The harm is real. And the conversation has barely begun.